it is my honor to introduce our plenary speaker, Loretta J. Ross.
Well, thank you all for that kind introduction. As a Harry Potter fan, it is quite an honor and so unexpected to be asked to keynote this conference. And I think I was asked to keynote it because of my more recent work on calling in the calling out culture. It is really a shame that those of us who largely share worldviews with each other can end up in these very bitter internal fights with each other. I actually think that there's a problem because many of us think that we're doing the right thing when we call each other out, but we're going about it the wrong way, because the way we're choosing to hold people accountable is more likely to invite people into conflict than into conversation. And so today I'm going to probably get myself in a whole lot of trouble as I talk about the conflict with trans activism and the attacks on J.K. Rowling and what many in the trans community would call her attacks on them. I think it actually starts out with all gender critical and trans views being treated all the same, which is not the case. Like with any other social justice or human rights movement, there's a left wing, there's a right wing, and there's a center. And what we're seeing in our present conflict is that trans views that are not misogynist or feminist views that are not transphobic are actually being ignored, while the more extreme views are being elevated, particularly in the mainstream media, because they make money profiting off of the conflict between people who are each other's problematic allies. And I think there's also a conflation of gender critical views with right-wing points of view, which are hostile towards trans people. And so, of course, the right-wing media is going to delight in attacking all trans people as if trans people are a monolith, and only representing the most extreme views that tend to overstate the harm that someone disagreeing with their view that they do, basically saying, if you don't agree with me, you're transphobic, and we know that rabbit hole. I do recommend for people who care about the overstatement of harm to read a wonderful book by Sarah Schulman called Conflict is Not Abuse, because it really speaks to the fact that within many of our progressive movement circles, we have such a severe overstatement of harm that we're trying to impose ideological conformity on each other. But I famously say, when many different people think many different thoughts and they move in the same direction, that's a human rights movement. But when many different people think the same thought and they move in the same direction, that's a human rights cult. And we are not cult builders. We are trying to appreciate that the diversity of opinion and thought is our strength, not our weakness. And as Audre Lorde famously says, the differences should not divide us unless we choose to let them divide us. So most trans people, as far as I can tell, are not trying to deny the reality of sex or that biological sex does not matter. You know, they're not truth deniers, but yet they can be besmirched as being so, as the mainstream media and the right wing tend to focus on this. It is important to recognize that biological sex is important when it's relevant, because it does matter, like with medical treatments and things like that. It's also an artifice of the white supremacist movement, and I'm pretty much an expert on that because that's the course I teach at Smith College, White Supremacy in the Age of Trump. And so for the last 30 years, I've done an intense study of white supremacy, fascism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, and things like that. One of the strategies of the white supremacy movement is to de-victimize people. First of all, to claim that the harm did not take place. And if you could deny that the harm took place, then you could deny that people should be held accountable for the harm that they committed. We see this in Holocaust denial. We see this in slavery denial. We see this in election denial. We see this all over the place because they're at war with the truth. And we need to make sure that we do not allow them the opportunity to de-victimize people who are harmed. And that's one of the problems I have with the extremists who have either gender critical views or trans affirming views that are also misogynist. Because if you deny the harm, then you deny that there were victims and people who were harmed. And I really do think that extreme denial of the relationship between sex and gender works the same way the color blindness does. It serves to deny the harms that people who are victims of white supremacy, particularly anti-Black racism, experience. And I think this is all being pushed by bad faith actors who are using these extremes because they're more devoted to conflict than unity, because it's profitable for them to push these narratives that the trans movement is inevitably misogynist and that the women's movement is inevitably transphobic. And they want to foment divisions between the women's rights and the trans rights movement. But one of the things I want us to affirm is that the trans identity is real, as well as women's identities are real. And our opponents do not want to accept the reality of the human rights of either trans people or women. And we see this, of course, in the recent abortion decision, Dobbs reversing Roe v. Wade, and the Don't Say Gay bills, and the accusations of trans people and queer people being groomers. And the more sanctimonious aspects of this attack is that they claim to be defending free speech, the right to say whatever you want to say without paying any consequences for what you said. And this is not a battle over free speech. It's a battle over whether or not people get to identify the harm that is being done to them while not overstating the harm. Because I've been in too many settings where my use of the word woman is read as a harmful statement. I was in a training a couple of months ago where I was describing the history of how reproductive justice was created by 12 Black women. And because I kept recounting the history of the 12 Black women who created the phrase, one of the participants in my training spoke up and said, well, every time you use the word woman, you are harming me. And I asked her, I said, well, wait a moment. Are you telling me that I have to rewrite history to protect you from your perception of harm? Because there were no trans women or trans men in that room at that time. And she wanted to continue to claim that my recounting the actual history was harmful to her. And I'm using her because that's the gender pronoun she preferred at the time. So all of this is leading to polarization and cultural wars, which brings me to J.K. Rowling. I know I've gone a long way around to bring it back home, but one of the unfortunate things that I think took place when this whole controversy erupted was that we did not have, as a society, the skill set to call her in versus calling her out. And it allowed the extremes of the conversation to be more prominent, the voices that are most likely to be heard. And anyway, what it ended up doing is backing her into a corner, ready to fight. I would argue that, well, one of the things that I've created in my work is what I call the 5C continuum. And the 5 C's are calling out, canceling, calling in, calling on, and calling it off. And I'll explain each of them and how each of them could have offered an option for how to deal with J.K. Rowling's. Calling out is obvious because that's publicly criticizing people for something that you think they've done wrong, for which you need to hold them accountable. And you choose to publicly shame them and blame them in order to pursue that accountability. Now, the fundamental problem with the calling out strategy is that instead of inviting a person into a conversation, you've invited them into a fight, because it is only human to respond defensively or to go on the attack yourself when somebody has publicly shamed and blamed you. That is not individuated to J.K. Rowling. Any of us would react that way when we feel that someone has chosen to publicly attack us. Now, the ultimate call out is canceling somebody when you want to deny them a voice, a platform, a job, or their reputation, because you think the harm that they've done is so severe that they should be treated as if they were a prisoner in exile. That's where you silence them. You want to forget them. You're trying to instruct society to forget them. You're trying to invisibilize them the same way we handle people within our own prison industrial complex. Now, there is a fundamental contradiction there, because those of us who are progressive and believe in human rights, why do we think we can use the tactics of the prison industrial complex within our own movement at the same time we call for prison abolition? It's an Audre Lorde's master's tools kind of tactic, which doesn't work. And I'm sure how we do the work is as important as the work we do, because how we do the work, the tactics we choose, are a reflection of our values, the same way a budget is a moral document. And I believe that calling in will be to the human rights movement in the 21st century that nonviolence was to the civil rights movement in the 20th century, a statement of our values, a statement of our process, and a statement of how we care for each other. The third C is calling in, and it's not a binary from calling out to calling in. Like I said, it's a continuum. This is when you're seeking to hold someone like J.K. Rowling accountable, but instead of calling her out with anger, blaming, and shaming, you're choosing to use love and respect as your tactic to get her attention, instead of angrily reacting to, I can't believe you said that transphobic statement kind of response. You can literally say, that's an interesting point of view. Why don't you tell me more and tell me how you arrived at that point of view? With that kind of calm approach, you've invited her into a conversation instead of a conflict. Unfortunately, that train's left the station because we're already in the middle of the conflict now. And so the question becomes, how do we pull it back? How do we calm things down? How do we have these conversations among people who do not want to represent either extreme? The fourth C is called calling on. And this was a concept invented by Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote the book, The Body Is Not an Apology. When you call on people, you are recognizing that you do not want to call them in or out, because either of those steps requires an investment of your time and energy into someone else's growth. And sometimes he doesn't want to give up your time and attention that way. So calling on is the request/demand for people to do better. And so you can call on people, for example, to align their inner good opinion of themselves with the words that come out of their mouths. And you can point out that those two things don't align. There's cognitive dissonance there. Why do you think you're a good person, yet you said this transphobic, racist, homophobic, sexist, whatever thing that came out of your mouth? Tell me who I'm dealing with. Am I dealing with the inner good you or the outer bad you kind of thing? So that I can make up my mind whether to call you in or out. And so I would like to ask J.K. Rowling, to align herself, to ask herself, what words would she choose to reflect her inner goodness and her capacity to offer grace and even forgiveness to the people who have harmed her with their calling out, and whether or not she understands that the whole concept of forgiveness is what you extend to others so that you can reclaim your own grace and dignity. It is an internal harm reduction strategy so that, as they popularly say, you're not offering free rent to someone in your own heart and soul, that you are forgiving yourself as a way to reclaim your dignity, reclaim ownership of your soul and your spirit. And that's the point of forgiveness, because many people mistakenly think that forgiveness is a weakness, is a vulnerability that you should never display, when in fact it's a harm reduction strategy for yourself, so that someone who's done wrong to you isn't leaving dirty fingerprints all over your life story, all over how you are in the world. And the fifth C is calling it off. This is a strategy of disengagement. You have no obligation to engage in unproductive dialogues with bad faith actors, with people who are weaponizing your words against you, who are choosing to misinterpret your words in a way that benefits them for, quote, winning the argument, even as they indulge in deceptions and lies and manipulation and stuff. And you can call it off either temporarily, like, I don't have the bandwidth to talk to you right now about this, or you can call it off permanently. I will never have the bandwidth to continue this unproductive conversation with you. And you can do this in person or online. And so I would like to offer us the opportunity to consider the 5 C's in relationship to J.K. Rowling. Now, how you call somebody in does matter. Again, you have to use grace, love, and respect to call people in. But you can't call people in effectively if you're still bleeding from your own wounds of trauma. Because if you're still bleeding, chances are your attempt to call them in, call them out, or call on them means you're just going to bleed all over them, because you have not yet healed from your trauma in a way to build a container to entertain someone else having a point of view that's different from yours. As a matter of fact, just them having a point of view different from yours will feel like more trauma, will feel like more harm. But if you are willing to do that self-assessment, if you are willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, and if you are willing to accept that other people are as complicated as you are, then you're in a space to call people in. And I find that it's very helpful to call people in, because calling in is a statement of who you are, not a statement of who they are. You're doing it because your integrity demands it, regardless of who you're trying to call in. A lot of people think that they can find the magic words to change other people, and those words don't exist for the most part. I mean, if we had that kind of magic word, couples wouldn't fight, colleagues wouldn't fight, families wouldn't fight. We don't have those magic words. But we do have the power, which I think is pretty impressive, to change how we offer ourselves into conversation, into relationships with other people with whom we don't have perfect alignment of our ideas, or have worked out any ground rules of agreement or anything like that. And I'll close by talking about what happens if you get called out, because that's usually useful for people to hear about. Whether you get called in or out, like happened to J.K. Rowling, we're going to all have the same very human reactions to it. We're going to feel embarrassed. We're going to feel like somebody put us on the spot. Somebody noticed that we made a mistake, that we're going to feel numb or defensive or angry or go on a counterattack. There's a whole range of human emotions that happen, whether you're called in or out. So that's not the point. But if you are called in or out, particularly if you're called out, there's 3 things I recommend that you do. Number 1, you thank people for the time and attention they just gifted you with. because they noticed you. They noticed you and they cared enough either about themselves or you to call something to your attention that you may not have been aware of. Quite often, call outs are preceded by the fact that people don't feel heard in other ways. And that's why they make them very public. You can sincerely thank people for calling something to your attention with a call out or a calling in if you remember the second step. The second step is to say, thank you for bringing that to my attention, and I've heard you, and I'm going to consider what you said. With that second step, you have not agreed with them, but you have signaled that very important step of having heard them, of having listened to them. And that is what most people want. They want to make sure that you've heard them and respect what they've said. And so with that saying that I've heard you and I'm going to consider what you said, that allows you to do that consideration on your own timetable, even as you tell them that they've been heard. And then the third step is to turn the calling in out into a calling in, because it's very, in my mind, possible to humanize people by saying something like, I'm glad you brought this to my attention, and I'm sure you could have brought this to my attention another way rather than doing it in such a public fashion. So since I care about you as much as I care about myself, I want to know what's going on with you. Why did you choose this way of calling attention to what I've done wrong? Are you okay? Are you feeling unheard? Are you feeling disrespected? What can I do for you so that you don't feel the need to go around calling people out to get attention to the trauma or the suffering or the harm that you're experiencing? Because we're all in this together, trying not to harm each other. And so, in closing, for some strange reason, I've been associated with J.K. Rowling simply because I signed a Harper's letter a couple of years ago, decrying, complaining about the call out culture. And about 150 people signed this letter in Harper's Magazine, and J.K. Rowling's was one of them. And the people who signed the letter are from the left, the right, and the center, because we all have concerns about the extremes of the call out culture and the irreparable damage that it's doing to relationships, to movements, to our body politic. And simply because J.K. Rowling's signature was amongst the 150s, next thing I know, I started getting called out because my name appeared on a list with J.K. Rowling, which I thought was kind of funny because, J.K. doesn't know me and I don't know her. I just read her books, right? And so to be associated with defending J.K. Rowling, which was kind of humorous, and it became a guilt by association process. And that's what happens with the toxicity of the call out culture. Because first, someone declares something is wrong for which they need to be held accountable. Then they decide that they can abstract it and then make a moral judgment about it. So it goes from J.K. Rowling said something that is transphobic into J.K. Rowling is a transphobe. So it now becomes a condemnation of her moral character. And this is done from a self-righteous stance of pseudo-moralism or pseudo-intellectualism. I know what transphobia is. I get to define it. And if you don't get to agree with my definition of it, you must be transphobic too. And then it's attached to that is this culture of unforgivability and unforgettability. Because once you have been identified as a transphobe or a homophobe or a racist or a sexist or whatever, then that will never be forgotten about you. It's like, the initials after your name, Loretta J. Ross, transphobe kind of thing. And no matter what I do, if I apologize for the remarks I made that got interpreted that way, then I'm seen as gaming the system. But if I don't apologize because I didn't think I actually said anything wrong or did anything wrong, then I'm seen as evading accountability. So it's a classic catch-22, damned if you do, damned if you don't. once you're caught up in a call out trap like that. And then the final step is what I call, then we all develop the political cooties. Because if anybody speaks up in defense of due process, says, wait a moment, let's examine what took place. Let's talk about whether what Loretta did or said was transphobic. Then you're accused of siding with the harm, of siding with the abuser. And so then that silences a lot of people because they don't want the target painted on their back next. And so we end up not even respecting true process, not respecting the hunt for truth and evidence. We just end up as mobbing people because we do not want to seem like we're on the side of injustice. So I'm going to shut up right there and allow Q&A, and thank y'all for listening to me.
Hi, Loretta. Can you hear me? Yep.
I hear you.
All right. I am Karen in the room with the mic, and I want to see if we have any questions here. The chat was largely comments and essentially taking notes on what you were saying, which leaves us for a real, I would say maybe once in a lifetime opportunity to ask Loretta Ross questions about a lot that's going on right now. All right, let's do Lori first because I saw her hand. Yep.
Hi, thank you for that talk. Many people would say that there was quite an attempt to call J.K. Rowling in at the beginning from a lot of LGBT organizations that offered to sit down with her and discuss, from the fandom that wanted to talk, from activists, and it seemed to have not worked. So I kind of have a two-part question of, one, what do we do with J.K. Rowling now after having attempted a call in that didn't seem to work? And two, what do those of us in the fandom who are now being called out for having anything to do with Harry Potter, even if we disassociated from J.K. Rowling, how do we respond to that calling out when we disagree with her and we don't want to be associated with her, but we still, find value in Harry Potter, but that's considered immoral to some people?
Well, in looking at your last question, y'all are suffering from political cooties, aren't you? So how can you appreciate the complicated work of a complicated person while denying an association with that person? I mean, I think that kind of revolves around the question of how we consider art. Can we ever disassociate the art from the artist? I believe that it is the most contradictory, complicated people that produce the most exquisite art because of the contradictions in their soul. And so I don't want to cancel Picasso because he was an asshole. I mean, it's just, these are conversations we need to have. With the first part of your question, we don't know what J.K. Rowling's experienced before the LGBTQ groups tried to talk to her. She could have been deeply wounded way early in the thing, in the process, that hardened her position and made her very defensive and unreceptive to calling in. One of the things I do know about calling in is that sometimes it has to be done multiple times. It can't be done just one and done. Well, we tried that, now we're just gonna call you out. Sometimes you have to find the right messenger to do it with. Certainly the right register matters. I do believe that people, like Maya Angelou always said, may not remember what you said, but they certainly will always remember how you made them feel. And so if people who are trying to call J.K. Rowling's in are making her feel under attack, humiliated, blamed, shamed, and punished, even if they don't think they're conveying that, but if they're conveying that, that's what it's going to feel like to her. And so I don't know the woman, I just know her books. And, but I would suspect that there's a longer trajectory of her engagement with this topic than what is publicly reported in the media. And even if she never, ever comes around to thinking this way, no human being is disposable. Because that's a statement of our willingness to practice necropolitics, not hers. And so we don't have the right to say that someone should suffer social exile because they have an opinion that we disagree with. I really don't think that's right. And I certainly don't think that's a true representation of our human rights values. Now, I think I briefly saw something in the chat about why it's okay to disassociate the art from the artist. I'm not quite sure how that is achieved, because isn't it the complicated life experience of the artist that gave the art? And I don't like decontextualizing or disassociating things that way. It doesn't, first of all, it doesn't even sound truthful. Things don't just appear out of the ethos. They appear because people had certain lived experiences that caused them to produce the art that we are now benefiting from, criticizing, and enjoying. So I'm not quite sure if disassociation can be anything but a mental gymnastics that we play with ourselves to avoid guilt by association.
Well, I think that if there's an author who's been long deceased, it's very common for us to say, well, I think Mary Shelley thought this when she wrote this scene in Frankenstein. But it's a different thing to say that about J.K. Rowling, who's still alive today and tweeting. Yes, but I wanted to just encourage everyone
So
here.
you're saying the fact that she hasn't conveniently died means that we can disassociate her?
No, I'm just saying it's harder to separate it when she's still alive, and also retconning to some extent her books. She's now saying things about the original text, like, oh, I really meant that, and I thought this, and here's a backstory
And
of
she doesn't have
that.
the right to do that to her own text?
Yes, but the text is published. It's done, right?
Yeah, so, and you never re-edited something you've published?
Not Harry Potter.
That's what I'm saying. You're setting her up to a standard that's not real. I'm sorry to sound so argumentative.
No, this is wonderful.
Real. I
Yeah.
publish stuff all the time, and when I know better, I do better. So,
Yep.
So I might republish. I wrote the history of reproductive justice and got the dates wrong. And so in the later editions, I got the dates right. I mean, why wouldn't she have the right to reinterpret her own writings as if it's in concrete and we consider it an affront for her to change her own works?
Hi, thank
How's
you so
that
much.
work?
Yeah, well, yeah, really. Question, you referred to the messenger and the register, and I was wondering if you could comment on what your thoughts are on about the fact that so much of this has taken place, certainly in the media, but especially on social media, where the communications are so brief, where to meaningful complex is inevitable. Dialogue seems to me very hard to achieve in that in those media, and how much that might have contributed to this.
Well, there's a saying that we have among those of us who are calling in practitioners, and I'm going to try to remember. One of my staff members wrote an acronym for Facebook and Twitter that I'm pulling up on my screen now so I can try to tell you about it. Just give me a second, because I can't remember it without looking at it, but I think it's really important to say what Lone Tran, the person I told you had created Facebook and Twitter, had created the calling in concept. And he says, Facebook means finding any cause to engage beyond our own knowledge. Twitter, typing without identifying the true error to resolve. This is what social media does. They monetize our grievances with each other, and they laugh all the way to the bank. Every time a Twitter outrage storm or Instagram outrage or Facebook outrage, the social media platforms have made a minimum of $500,000. So we're like the unpaid interns to the social media world. When we indulge our desire for attention and appreciation and affirmation over social media. One of the things we can better use social media for is learning how to call people in over social media, how to refuse to engage in social media mob scenes against other people, and stop trying to signal our wokeness in the woke competition of social media. These are choices that we get to make about how we present in the world. Now, we may be unable to stop a Twitter mob storm, but we do have a choice of whether to participate in it. And if there's anybody in it that we know personally, we can ask them, how do they benefit by dumping on the humanity of another person? Exactly what does that do for you? And how do you feel about yourself when you do that? And so, yeah, the whole way the attention economy manipulates us is, of course, shameful, and in my mind, is a human rights violation. But we have choices, like Frantz Fanon says, to whether we're going to participate in our own oppression, the own colonization of our minds.
Hi, so I'm thinking about how do we make a bridge between calling out to calling in? Because I think so much of our media, so much of our parenting really trains us to just go right into defense, right into like throwing up a wall, right into anger. And calling in actually takes a lot of vulnerability, both for the person who's expressing that they were hurt and also for the person who maybe needs to make amends. And maybe that person who, you know, we perceive to needs to make amends, like isn't ready to be vulnerable. And so I guess I'm just curious that, like, do you have tools? Do you have thoughts, ideas, ways of, you know, like it takes tremendous courage to be vulnerable. You know, what are steps that we can work towards, you know, every day to be more in this complex human experience of vulnerability, which in my own my own life has taken a lot of time and energy and dedication and is not really an available resource necessarily to everyone around us.
It has taken a lot of very traumatic experiences in my life to see the power of vulnerability. I did not realize how it was a strength building and harm reduction process, because I always saw vulnerability like forgiveness as a weakness. And in fact, it is so powerful. Like you said, it takes a lot of courage to be publicly vulnerable or even privately vulnerable with someone you love. And once I repurposed my interpretation of it, it became something that I'm willing to risk on larger and larger platforms and with more and more strangers, because we're all socializing kind of like a kith and kin system where we only trust the people we know and the people that know us, and even not all of them. And so it's very hard for us to overcome that social conditioning to extend trust to strangers, to show our vulnerabilities to strangers and things like that. But I see showing my vulnerabilities as a reclamation of myself, as a way of trusting not only that I can display my vulnerabilities, but I also have the resilience to recover from attempts to exploit my vulnerability, because I get to decide what harm other people are trying to project on me that I'm going to accept. I mean, other than physical harm, but I'm talking about the social, the psychological, the emotional kinds of harms that people are trying to project on me. I mean, as a trauma survivor, even at age 14, as a victim of incest, I had to decide whether or not I was going to let my abuser's dirty fingerprints determine who I am. And at age 14, I said, no, I am more than what's happened to me. And that's been my mantra all my life. I will always be more than what other people try to do to me, because I want to self-determine who I am, not the life experiences. And as has been famously said, you know, what you've been through is just what you've been through. It's not a resume. You have to actually add some knowledge to what you've been through in order to consider yourself an expert on any topic. And so vulnerability for me is a choice that I make. And I found that not showing my vulnerabilities didn't work very well, particularly when you're the authority figure managing an organization or the person with the power in an organization and stuff like that. Then failing to show my vulnerabilities meant that I didn't have a platform for showing when things hurt me, so that people could visit on me all of their issues with power and authority, but I wasn't able to show how that hurt and show how vulnerable I could be in my own doubts, my own imposter syndrome, all those other things. And the emotional energy into hiding my pain was just taking a terrible toll on my soul. So I decided to do something different with it. Vulnerability is a strength strategy.
We have a question from online in the chat. How do you understand the role of power dynamics in the ability to call in? For example, Rolling is highly, highly unlikely to talk to any of us directly for a conversation on this topic. But my trans friends who feel deeply harmed by her statements or stance may see me as tacitly complicit in her opinion if I don't call out in some ways. How does her status as a celebrity and our individual need to manage our interpersonal relationships affect the ability to call in?
Well, first of all, I would caution against calling out other people, particularly if it edges on attacking their humanity, to signal how woke you are. Because that's just bullying by a mob. There's no other way to describe that. And you're not doing it to help the other person. You're doing it to show off your own wokeness kind of thing. And that's all for the wrong reasons, in my opinion. So you join in bullying somebody because your friends who are also bullying expect it of you kind of thing. I mean, we should grow out of those kinds of patterns sometimes, Jacob, celebrities who are called out generally don't suffer from the call outs. As a matter of fact, their currency is fame and attention. And so calling attention to what they're doing wrong or right usually means that they laugh all the way to the bank. So if that's the point of calling them out, that you're trying to pauperize them or make them suffer some reputation damage, it probably won't work anyway. But you call people out or in because of what you do for yourself, not what harm you want to do to them. So maybe the motivations need to be examined on why you're doing it in the first place. Now, I've been invited to mob people all the time. I mean, whether it's mobbing the white person who says something racist, or the Black person who says something misogynist, or the anti-Semite who says something, bad about Jews. I mean, I'm called upon to denounce people all the time. But I tell everyone who invites me to do that I don't practice the politics of denunciation, because I work on the assumption that the person you want me to denounce is as complicated as I am and as complicated as you are. So we all are good people capable of doing bad things, as well as bad people are capable of doing good things. And so I don't one-dimensionalize people to what I think they've done wrong, nor do I worship them for what I think they've done right. We should have a much more sophisticated analysis of our relationships of human interdependence than that.
I think that a problem a lot of people have with this particular celebrity making her opinions known about the topic of transness is that she's not just voicing her opinions and saying, well, that's what I think about it, period, end of story. She's actually now working now with organizations who are trying to change laws that actively make it virtually impossible for trans people to exist in public. And so the real problem there is that it's an ad hominem attack. The identity of the person is being attacked rather than their actions. And people are asking J.K. Rowling to change her actions, not her identity, whereas she and the organization that she's working with are attacking people for their identities. And there's this disconnect there. And the organization's actively making it difficult for people to exist in the world if they're trans. And I think that that's the conundrum we come to over and over over the years of the difference between when we want to be tolerant of different opinions, but it has to kind of stop at the point where you are questioning another person's very humanity. And so that makes this very complicated, that the ad hominem attack has evolved.
See, I see so much conflation taking place that we're not peeling apart all the interrelated and interconnected strands. So we quickly jump from somebody's having an opinion on a bill to that bill wiping out the identity of trans people. I can't make that conceptual leap, not to mean that trans people are not under attack. Of course, they're massively under attack by the same forces that are attacking gay people, Black people, immigrants, Muslims. You know, they're the same dang people. And so I see all of these attacks by the ideology of white supremacy, which is separate from the identity of whiteness, as something we should unite to fight, because they threaten the existence of all of us. But I do not conflate someone having opinion on a bill that I may disagree with them being part of the Nazi Party. I mean, let's be real here. There are people who are trying to wipe us off the face of the earth, and they're using very deadly means to do so. That should not be conflated with people having differences of opinion on things that are quite controversial and yet to be, and still being debated within our society about the relationship between sex and gender and stuff like that. I just think we're conflating too much and then assigning too much responsibility to the wrong damn party. Because there are people who are committed to annihilating the existence of anybody who is different. And the fact that we can't stay focused on them while we preoccupy ourselves with someone who is a problematic person is a distraction to me. I mean, we've got a global rise of fascism happening right now, and it's not even hidden. It's operating in plain sight. The gravest threat to democracy since liberal democracy was invented. And we're allowing ourselves to participate in the culture wars, dancing to the tunes of our opponents. I want to know how well that's working for us, because I know how well it's working for them.
So
Hi, thank you. You said we're assigning too much responsibility to the wrong party, but it's just so wild. Why do we assume that she's not under a wrong party? What if she is?
Because I haven't seen anything else that she's written that's fascistic. I mean, I'm very willing to call out a fascist, a white supremacist. I'm very willing to call people who they demonstrate what they are by what they do. Like Maya says, when people show you who they are, believe them. But this debate on on gender and sex is so prevalent right now and so convoluted that I simply cannot accept that someone who has differences of opinion than me and the majority of us should be called a fascist because they have a difference of opinion. Otherwise, we don't understand the definition of fascism.
Hello. So in Malcolm X's autobiography, he has this quote, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but to paraphrase, he says that if you're in a car with someone and they're driving in the wrong direction, you don't yell at them and say you're driving in the wrong direction. You just let them keep going until they're ready to ask for directions, and then you tell them the right way to go. That sounds like a type of calling off, a temporary calling off in terms of a conversation with someone. And maybe that's what's necessary for J.K. Rowling to do a temporary calling off and let her drive in the wrong direction until she's ready to ask for directions. But how long do you let someone drive in the wrong direction until they drive off a cliff? You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
That is a good question. I don't believe in being passive about those kinds of things. If I was in a car with someone driving in the wrong direction, I wouldn't take a passive approach. I would take a questioning approach. So-and-so, do you think we're driving in the right direction? Have you checked the map? Are you sure where we're going to end up if we keep pointing in this way? Instead of making it an accusation, you're going wrong, why not make it an inquiry? Have you checked? That's a calling in approach versus an accusatory approach. You see what I'm saying? As opposed to a passive approach. Go off the cliff and then I can say, I told you so. I mean, we have so many choices in how we can choose to be truthful with ourselves and honest with others. But we have to do so with love and respect. As I maintain, you can say anything to anybody through the register of love and respect. And you can tell people I love you in a tone of disrespect and cause more harm than you'll ever know. And so how you say it matters. That you say it matters. I don't want to ever be in a I told you so position. I'd rather offer him a chance to self-correct. Because see, the problem isn't whether or not human beings make mistakes. Hell, we all make mistakes. Matter of fact, most of us are lucky enough to have made our mistakes before cell phones were invented, because otherwise they'd be memorialized forever. But the problem isn't that we make mistakes. The problem is whether or not we handle our mistakes as children, or do we handle them as adults? And when people deny that they've made a mistake, double down on their mistakes, like J.K. Rowling has done, deny the harm of their mistakes, as she has often done, and don't want to make a plan for doing better in the future, then she's basically handling it as a child. So apparently we've struck her inner child. But when you handle a mistake as an adult, you recognize the harm that you've done, you apologize for the harm that you've done, and you make a plan for doing better in the future. But as you know, like with parenting, you cannot beat a child into adulthood and make it work. It takes helping people learn from their mistakes, helping people appreciate their fallibility and their ability to recover from making a mistake, and show them that they're still a part of our community, even as we know about their mistakes, because we're not trying to build a community of white supremacy perfectionism. We're trying to build a community of authentic human beings who are capable of not only making mistakes, but owning our mistakes so that we can do better, and not being afraid of mistakes because we know they're learning opportunities for all of us. So with JK, I probably will be condemned for offering a perspective on calling her in. Because, like I said, there's a guilt by association thing that I've already been through. But that doesn't matter, because let me just say some of my background, because you may not know this. As a rape and incest survivor, I went into Lorton Reformatory in Washington, D.C. and taught Black feminist theory to men who had raped and murdered women. And I could have conversations with them. I was shot at by a white supremacist when I was 10 years old. Yet I've deprogrammed people in the white supremacist movement and had conversations with them. And I don't think I'm some superior being. I'm a person who doesn't let what happened to me define how I behave with other people now. And we all get a chance to make that choice.
So I have a practical question, because the things that you talked about, the conflicts that you've stood up to, I did figure that was in your background. What do you do when you would like to call in somebody who's not in good faith, who adopts the language of being called in, but is secretly advancing a really hostile agenda? For example, say Supreme Court Justice saying, if you nominate me, of course I'll uphold Roe versus Wade. And then the moment they're in, they do exactly what you knew. But if you're being civil, if you're adopting calling in manners as you've been advocating, then they already know that. What do you What do you do then?
See, do not read me as saying calling in is for every situation, because there's some people who really do need to be called out. There are very appropriate uses of the call outs. People who abuse their power over other people, people who are not operating in good faith, people who have been offered a chance to change and don't. Sometimes repeated offers a chance, and maybe J.K. Rowling is in that category. You use call outs to identify hidden or invisibilized harms, or to build community with people who have been harmed. There's good and appropriate uses of the call out. The problem that most of us who do the call out culture, though, is that they don't realize that in the human rights movement, we call out governments and corporations and individuals who violate people's human rights all the time. But the call out is our tactic of last resort, not our tactic of first resort. That's where people get it wrong. They start out with the call out and think things go downhill from there, instead of starting with the invitation to a conversation, a chance to find common ground, a chance to build conversation. Instead, we start with an attack and then wonder why nobody wants to listen to us. But the problem is that once you've put someone on the defensive and made them feel attacked, you are not someone they would trust to listen to anymore, because you've already made them feel harmed. And I'm not quite sure why they would ever want to listen to you after you already made them feel like you had no regard for their humanity, even if your cause is just and you're defending the humanity of other people. And so, yeah, there are appropriate uses to call out. So I call out white supremacists. And my mother used to say, there's some people you work with and there's a lot of people you need to work around. And so part of doing an adequate threat assessment is deciding who's a problematic ally versus who's an actual opponent.
We do have time, I believe, for one more question, but in this just pause, I wanted to somewhat advertise tomorrow at about 2:00. We have a whole session on J.K. Rowling and the trans community with a number of interesting talks, followed by a workshop by our colleagues on the HPAG board, which is focused on restorative conversations. There is a place for us all. So I think a lot of the questions we've been asking is how do we deal with different sort of factions within the Harry Potter fan community? And that's exactly what this workshop is going to be dealing with tomorrow night. And so if you are interested in continuing the conversation, I know that we'd love to have you. Yeah. Is there room? Yep, one more question. Yeah.
I think tomorrow night, I know I can't come because I'm keynoting another conference in Kansas tomorrow night, but I do want to say in my own advertisement that me and my team teach calling in techniques on Tuesday nights for the next 3 Tuesday nights from 7 to 9 Eastern time. And you can register for it on my website, and each lecture is only $5. So the whole package for 4 lectures is $20. I call it the Walmart of consciousness raising. Just for a cup of coffee. For a cup of coffee, you can learn about the theory and the practical application of the calling in culture. So I just want to remind people that that's available at lorettajross.com for $5.
Okay, one last question, and that one's from me. One of the things you said is that you have to reach out to see the humanity of the person that you're trying to engage with. But you've also talked about the person you might be trying to engage with is maybe a white supremacist or a racist. How do you have advice on how to affect yourself to get past the tendency to not want to reach out to a person like this and find a way to get into that humanity that is almost impossible to see?
I start off by not conflating identity with ideology. I refuse to practice identity determinism like the white supremacists do. I want to be the opposite of that, actually. So I don't think because someone has a certain gender or racial identity that I'm going to be able to predict what they think or believe. As we know, not all white people are white supremacists, and certainly not all white supremacists are white. So I tend to use my very Southern habits because I'm from Texas. And we spend 10 minutes saying hello just so we can see if you're worth talking to or not. And in that first 10 minutes, we can figure out pretty much where you're coming from because we're going to ask you very inquisitive questions like, who's your people? And, do you go to church or whatever, and I'm so in church, so don't read anything from that. But we have a tendency to make judgments based on our own relationship to identitarian politics, and then let that be by our confirmation bias against what we hear from someone who has those identities. And so I try to counsel people not to play the identity determinism of the white supremacist movement, even though we've all been socialized in that. We have choices out of breaking out of that brainwashing, the same way we have choices out of breaking out of the brainwashing of not practicing self-forgiveness and learning how to forgive others.
Hi, Loretta. It's Karen Wendling again, one of the coordinators. I just wanted to thank you for being here today. This was wonderful, and especially with the extreme Zoom gymnastics we put you through, logging onto our session. We are so happy you persisted and that you were able to be here with us. And I will pass the microphone to my co-coordinator, Patrick McCauley, who will also like to thank you.
Hi, Loretta. It's Patrick. I just want to extend my personal thanks. I was been working with Jean over the past number of months after I heard you speak on Radio Times here in Philadelphia, and heard the things that you were talking about and thought you might be a perfect fit. And it was not easy to organize your presence here today, but you were very gracious in allowing for different manipulations of the options until finally you could get here. And it was a personal favor to me. I saw it that way, and I wanted to thank you personally for everything that went into you and Jean and everyone else there who worked to make sure that you could be here with us today.
Well, I have 5 jobs, as my West Indian background shows. When we're West Indians, you have less than 3 jobs. We can accuse you of being slackers. And so my schedule is crazily busy, but I'm living my best life.
Well, we feel the same way as professors.
Yeah, well, teaching at Smith is my 5th job. I had 4 jobs before Smith gave me tenure.
And I did actually want to bring up that your comments about the rise of fascism really made me think back to our 2020 plenary speaker, Timothy Snyder, who wrote the book on tyranny.
Oh my God, on tyranny.
Yes, you were coming in a grand line of Harry Potter plenary speakers. So we're really happy to have you.
I teach his book in my class.
Yeah. So I'll ask for one last round of applause for our wonderful plenary speaker. Thank you so much.
Well, thank y'all for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye. I know.